Most of you probably already know that there are lobes in the cerebrum. And you've probably heard of the first four that are listed there: frontal, parietal, temporal, and occipital. And some of you may have actually even heard about the insula. Here's a map of the ones that you are able to visualize. The insula is going to be deep to those. So the frontal lobe, parietal lobe, occipital lobe, and temporal lobe conveniently sit deep to the bones, which bear the same names. I like this because it shows you a brain that has been dissected out nice and neat. And you can see the various sulcuses that you need to know. Of course, you cannot see my cursor on this, but in between the frontal and parietal lobe, the one that I absolutely positively want you to know is the central sulcus. Yep, and the one, the sulcus, I learned it as fissure, in between the frontal lobe and the temporal lobe, and the parietal lobe and the temporal lobe is going to be the lateral sulcus or fissure. You can also see the transverse cerebral fissure marked. That is the one that is dividing the cerebrum from the cerebellum. And this shows you the frontal lobe and the temporal lobe reflected back, so you can start to see the insula, which is deep to those. These are the functions, many functions of the frontal lobe. Remember that the motor cortex, which is located in the precentral gyrus, is within the frontal lobe. That is going to initiate all voluntary muscle movements. Let me repeat that. The motor cortex, which is housed within the precentral gyrus, initiates all voluntary muscle movements. So every time you move a skeletal muscle, it starts there. Now, because of their location, frontal lobes are very vulnerable to any sort of injury because they're right there in the front of the cranium. They're also superior to the wing of the sphenoid. So if something happens and you have damage, that sphenoid bone, which is actually not too terribly, I don't want to say stable, it's pretty fragile. The bones are quite thin. That could actually pierce your frontal lobe. So be nice to your brain. Personality, motor function, problem solving, spontaneity, memory, language, initiation, judgment, impulse control, social and sexual behavior. All of those will be controlled and get input from other parts of the brain associated with the frontal lobe. This is the one that's kind of responsible for executive decision making. We do need to talk about the homunculus. So the homunculus is actually a way of visualizing the connection between various parts of the body and the amount of the brain hemisphere that is associated with that part. So I always thought that this would be a great Halloween costume. If you take a look at the diagram on the right, you're looking at what's known as the motor homunculus. And again, remember that that's of the motor cortex. So that is going to sit in the precentral gyrus. It shows you the percentage of your cortex that is associated with various body parts. So you can see that a much larger amount is going to be associated with the face, particularly the mouth and the eyes, and the hand and the fingers relative to the torso and the feet and legs. So you have more processing power because there's more processing area associated with those particular parts of the body. He's kind of creepy. looking in a cool way. So again, precentral gyrus is the somatomotor cortex, and that shows you various images to show you the homunculus as it is associated with the primary motor cortex. Remember, the cortex is a very thin layer of gray matter that is the most superficial part of the brain, and we'll talk more about that in another section. Again, homunculus. So there are going to be some pretty important asymmetrical differences within the frontal lobes. The left frontal lobe is going to be more involved in controlling the movements associated with language, and the right frontal lobe is going to play a role in nonverbal abilities. So again, everything about the nervous system is not absolute. With most people, both lobes are going to be playing a role in virtually everything you do. But that sort of gives you something to use as a guideline. Again, we use the homunculus in order to reflect the relative amount of space that various body parts will occupy either on the motor cortex or the sensory cortex. Now, parietal lobe. Parietal lobe is considered the association cortex because it does a lot of integration. It's going to integrate what you see, what you hear, and what you touch or feel. It will also play a role in helping you maintain attention. It will also play a role in your sense of space and your body's in relationship to that space. And the name for that is, anybody remember? Proprioception. Proprioception is knowing where your body is in space. So the parietal lobe is going to play a role in helping maintain that. The occipital lobe, as soon as you hear occipital lobe, I want you to think processing visual information. Please do not tell me vision. Vision, the structure that has responsibility for vision will be your eye. So your eyes are responsible for vision. Anytime you talk about the brain, particularly of the cortex, you have to say integration or association or processing of vision when you're talking about the occipital lobe. And if you write down primary function of the occipital lobe is the visual cortex, houses the visual cortex, perfect. Don't tell me a sense or an action. Tell me cortex, visual cortex, motor cortex, sensory cortex, for example, or processing visual information, because that's what the occipital lobe does. It receives and processes visual information. Temporal lobe is going to receive and process incoming auditory information because it contains the auditory cortex. Now I want you to take a look at the pathway that's shown in the image on the right. You will see that some of the sounds that come in from the left ear will be processed on the right, and some of the sounds that come in from the left ear will be processed on the left. The same is true for vision. Some of the information coming in from your right eye will be processed on the left side of your occipital lobe. Some will be processed on the right side, some will be processed on the left. The same is true of your left eye. Some of the information will be processed, visual information will be processed on the left side, some will be processed on the right side. There's actually several important reasons for that. When it comes to sight, it gives you basically stereoscopic vision. And also, if you damage one eye, you can still see. You have better depth, even if you lose vision in one eye. And if you have a pituitary tumor, which damages the optic chiasm, which sits just anterior to the pituitary, you can still see out of both eyes. When it comes to hearing, you want to process information on both sides of your brain so you can help localize sound. And we'll go over this again when we're in the sensory, the part on special senses. All right, the insula. That is a link to this fascinating article that was published in the New York Times a number of years ago about the insula. It's a very small part of the brain, and it has amazing effects. And look at how many it has. One of the main functions is what's known as interoreceptive awareness. In other words, it's telling you what's going on in your body. So it's going to process information about heart rate, blood pressure, whether or not you feel pain, what your skin temperature is, whether or not your GI tract is distended, whether or not your bladder is full or empty, and vestibular sensations, and that has to do with balance and equilibrium. So this will also play a role in proprioception. This shows you the insula, and it also gives you some ideas. The one on the right gives you some, the picture on the right gives you some ideas of what it's responsible for providing information on and interpreting. And it will also play a role in motor control. It will also play a role in homeostasis in terms of helping monitor feedback loops that control various systems. It also gives you a sense of self relative to the rest of the world. Social emotions and emotions, that has to do with feelings. The thing that I really remember quite vividly were our feelings of disgust if you see something that is appalling. So yeah, insula has a number of functions, many of which are not too terribly well understood and are also interconnected with other parts of the brain.